Curt Weiss has spent over 35 years in the media industry. In the 80s, he was a prominent drummer on the New York scene under the name Louis King. And for the last 25 years, he has been a television writer and producer, and of course now an author. So without further ado, please help me welcome Curt Weiss.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Elliott Bay Books, for making this happen. I'm here to talk about Jerry Nolan and this book I spent a little while writing called Stranded in the Jungle. I'll tell you who Jerry was, the bands he was in, the influences he had, both musically and stylistically, and how in turn he influenced others, as well as how troubled he was. Jerry Nolan was the drummer for two of the most influential and infamous rock and roll bands of their time, the glam proto-punk New York Dolls and the first wave punk rock Heartbreakers, not the Tom Petty Heartbreakers who came out of Florida in '76, but the New York Heartbreakers, who started in the spring of '75 after Jerry and fellow New York Doll Johnny Thunders left the Dolls. Each of these groups featured the aforementioned and equally notorious Johnny Thunders, while the original Heartbreakers also featured punk originator Richard Hell, he of Torn Clothes, Spiked Hair, and composer of Blank Generation. So Jerry's punk resume is as authentic as anyone's. These bands were legendary, not only in New York on the CBGB's scene, where in '74 Television, the Ramones, Blondie, and even the Talking Heads took some sort of sustenance from the Dolls, but in the UK too, where many of the early punk bands, the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the Damned, took something either directly or indirectly from the Dolls, Johnny Thunders, or Jerry. And of course, Sex Pistols manager, punk clothing designer, and music maker Malcolm McLaren got his first taste of working in the music industry and rock and roll. In that short period, he managed the Dolls in '75. The Dolls were the bridge between glam and punk, and to many hip New Yorkers and members of the press, they were the second coming of the Rolling Stones. But they were just too raw and too crude and seemingly too effeminate. I mean, to do this in 1973 was really just the kiss of death. People outside of New York and little pockets of others that just would not listen to it. They were on the Midnight Special in the fall of '73. Most bands, when you're on national TV, you sell more records. The next week, their record actually went down in the charts. They broke up in '75 after releasing only 2 records. After struggling for a year and a half as the Heartbreakers, Richard Hell left the band to pursue a solo career, and the Heartbreakers just lucked out, brought their New York attitude to London in December of '76, where they became the first American punk band to tour the country, base themselves there, and record their lone album, L.A.M.F. The influence in the Dolls and the Heartbreakers has been acknowledged by not only the early New York and London punk groups, but Ireland's Undertones, Morrissey and Marr of the Smiths. By the way, Morrissey saw them on the British TV show. Thank you. What would I do without you, Al? You should know. And they did a song called Jet Boy, which was the single, and he went to a store the next day to buy it. And when he said, "Do you have this record by the New York Dolls called Jet Boy?" and the salespeople kind of laughed, like, "Oh, I told you, somebody would buy that thing." And he goes, "Oh, at last I am somebody," he said. But I mean, that's how the Dolls were to people. It was made you feel like you mattered in some strange way. The Replacements from Minneapolis, X from L.A., Henry Rollins from D.C., all make the Heartbreakers and the Dolls a key influence on '80s indie rock. If you look at the '80s record covers and the videos of bands like Motley Crue, this record sold over 4 million copies. Twisted Sister, this record sold over 3 million copies. Poison, they sold over 3 million of this record, and then, of course, Guns N' Roses. If you can see, that's Duff McKagan. He tweeted out a couple of years ago, L.A.M.F, and it's really almost impossible to see on his arm. He's got a tattoo of L.A.M.F. I mean, that's how much the Dolls or the Heartbreakers meant to these bands. They had MTV. They took what you might call effeminate look and turned it to more cartoon. They had some devil horns, they turned it into something that, originally it wasn't. But, what this means to me is that over a 17-year period from '74 to '91, major movements in rock and roll were deeply impacted by the New York Dolls and the Heartbreakers. And if you think of who else had that much of an impact, the Beatles, the Stones, Dylan, Bowie, Led Zeppelin, the Velvet Underground, the Ramones, they're all in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The Dolls and the Heartbreakers are not. So I guess you can kind of see where I'm going with this. I firmly believe that bands are not great in spite of their drummers, that every great band has a drummer who is part of why they are great. So a reasonable question is, what was so special about Jerry? He was an economical, creative, yet nuanced drummer, crafting a style that became very much the template for punk drumming, influencing both Clem Burke from Blondie, Tommy Ramone from the Ramones. First wave punk drummers with both of very different styles. You can most certainly hear it in the playing of Paul Cook of the Sex Pistols on their one album, where you'd swear some of those songs sounds just like Jerry playing with Johnny Thunders, except it's Paul Cook and Steve Jones. Jerry's simple, unobtrusive, never miss an accent style. It propels the music the same way Ringo Starr's playing drove Beatle records. People who've played with Jerry describe it as a style that carries the rest of the band along. And that drive comes from listening to the earliest rock and roll, but also pre-rock and roll and R&B and swing music, which is where he found his greatest idol, Gene Krupa. And that is Jerry with Gene Krupa in 1963 or so, when Jerry's about 16 or 17, has one of the best pompadours I've ever seen in my life. Gene Krupa, probably the person most responsible for bringing drums to the forefront in 20th century popular music. You listen to Trash off the first Dolls album, you listen to the Stranded in the Jungle off the second album, or Chinese Rocks or Baby Talk off L.A.M.F., and they all just like reek of Gene Krupa. From Krupa and the other early R&B rock and roll drummers, he not only absorbed drive, but something called swing. You don't necessarily have to play in a swing band to play with swing. It's when not referring to the specific style of music, it's about smoothing the edges off of rhythm. It's kind of why a drum machine or computerized drumming doesn't work for all music. Ringo had it. Charlie Watts had it with the Stones. The great 50s R&B drummers, Panama Francis, who played on like the early Ray Charles and the Platters and Joe Turner records, and Earl Palmer, who played with the great Fats Domino and Little Richard records that came out in New Orleans, and some Eddie Cochran's hits and Phil Spector hits. They all had that, and Jerry absorbed all of that. But his musicianship was more than simply that of drummer. He was a composer, taking a role in writing with bandmate Walter Lore about half of the songs on the Heartbreakers' lone album, L.A.M.F. He was a singer, put out a solo record in the 80s, and he was also a very keen musical arranger. Many bands tell me that he really took a strong hand in arranging their music, so which all of this makes him a more complete musical package than he's given credit for. Also from Krupa and other heroes like Elvis, Frankie Lyman, Gene Vincent, and then later the Jimi Hendrix Experience, he also picked up a sense of style. It was important to Jerry to not look like everyone else. He wanted to stand out, be it the animated way he played the drums, the clothing he wore, the way he styled his hair, and by his pink drums, which were his signature. And he called all of this profiling. This was valuable to him since, drummers are stuck in the back of the stage, and you've got the guitarist and the lead singer, working the crowd, and they're running all over the place, and you're just stuck in the back. So he wanted to be seen. But throughout his professional career, years before he was in any band of renown, people thought he was a star. They just couldn't figure out what band he was in. Despite spending much of his formative years as a traveling army brat, he was as New York as you could get. He was like something out of a Martin Scorsese film. He was urban, opinionated, funny, offensive, moody, boastful, stubborn, stylish, wisecracking, trend-setting, and a raconteur of the highest order. And in a similar Scorsese-like vein, he loved street gangs, because to him, gangs and rock and rollers were interchangeable. He loved their common sense of style, he loved their commitment to one another, and they all had a family-like loyalty that extended into his personal life, as well as any band he was in. So if Jerry was all of these wonderful, talented, innovative, and colorful things, you might reasonably wonder, why was he never a star? And some of that is because he and the Dolls were just too early for the masses. Jerry was always very good at seeing a trend to come. Some of that is because he trusted very few people and couldn't be mentored. But it's also because the last 17 years of his life, he was a heroin addict, and then he was a methadone addict. He loved barbiturates. He loved speedballs, cocaine, heroin cocktails. While it could be argued that the drug use was a symptom of deeper psychological problems having to do with abandonment, by his biological and surrogate fathers, time and again, drug addiction got in the way of his ability to grab the brass ring of success, and it's sadly what turned him into a tragedy as he watched others pass him on the road to success. People like Susie Quattro, whose band he played in 71, 72, and she became a star and she sold millions of records and was later on Happy Days as a continuing character. He played with Billy Squier, who sold millions of records in the 80s and was all over MTV. He played with and dated Bette Midler, who became a star as big as anyone of her time. He grew up with Peter Criss from Kiss. He taught him to play the drums, and Kiss were just ubiquitous in the 70s, and they still fill arenas around the world. And even the other dolls went on to solo careers or acting careers or cult stardom, but most of those mentioned, they held on to some glimmering remembrance of Jerry's shining talent or star potential, but Jerry could never reach their level, and he never really recovered from it. Hearing people credit Britain with inventing punk rock, or seeing what he called the Johnny clones, all those 80s bands had somebody that looked like Johnny Thunders. He called them the Johnny clones. That just tore at him, and he said to more than one person, beside that being a misstatement of history, he would say, "I'm not only paying my own dues, but some other motherfuckers." And that's a big reason why I was attracted to Jerry's story. I wanted to know more about him, with all that he had going with him. Why couldn't he succeed? Because, I was struck by him. I just thought he was it when I saw him play. So the next question is, why did I write a book about Jerry? And some of you may know I was a drummer. I had a name, Louis King, Louis like Jerry Lee, King like Elvis. And I played in a band that Jerry had played in previously called the Rockettes, and I must have seen him play a half dozen times in that band in 1980. And this was after the breakup of the Dolls, and after the breakup of the Heartbreakers, and after his involvement with Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen, that whole horrible tragedy. But it was clear to me, that he had star quality and was incredibly impressive, even from the back of the stage. And just being a drummer in a rock and roll band in New York in the wake of the Dolls and the Heartbreakers helped me relate to some of the things he went through, the struggles and the failures, the allure of alcohol and drugs, and striving to be seen as more than just a timekeeper. But I was starstruck by him, and I wanted to know more. In the drummers, you had a bunch of different styles that were prominent. There was Simon Kirke and from Free and Bad Company, and this guy Buffin, Dale Griffin from Mott the Hoople. They were known as like straight ahead drummers, and they didn't do anything fancy or technical, but they kept out of the way of the beat, and they knew to keep out of the way of the hook and not get in the singer's way, and when to hit an accent. And you also had the prog rock guys like Bill Bruford from Yes and King Crimson, or Neil Peart from Rush, and they took their very experimental, non-traditional path. And John Bonham from Led Zeppelin, and Ian Pace from Deep Purple, who just had stunning power and technique, but could still supply what was needed for a conventional sort of radio pop song. So when Jerry and the Dolls were first on television, the first time I saw them in late '74, it all seemed so out of step and crude and simplistic, even compared to the other glam acts like T-Rex and Bowie and Slade. So by the time I went to college for music at the Boston's Berklee School of Music, glam rock was over. This is '77. I was tiring of progressive rock and jazz and classical, and friends started to tell me about Patti Smith and Blondie. And then Lou Reed, who I'd already loved, because I liked glam music, he was on the cover of this weird new magazine called Punk. And there was also this other group in the magazine called the Ramones. And they just seemed like they were out of Mad Magazine. They were so cartoonish. But what it illustrated to me was there was a direct linkage between glam and punk. And so, I turned 18 December 10th, and none of my roommates seemed to know or care, and that was the legal age for drinking. So I said, I am going to stop at a club tonight. And I finished my job in Kenmore Square in Boston and made my way to Alston, where there was this club, and there was this guy playing there. And I just, I knew he had a little something to do with this punk thing, and he was like kind of a contorted Buddy Holly. And that was Elvis, Costello, and the Attractions. And I just happened to catch their first tour of America. If I had been born 2 days later, I would never have seen him. Or 2 days earlier, I would never have seen him. And I just thought they were just vital and exciting and explosive. And they had Pete Thomas, who I would still argue with you is one of the best drummers ever. I mean, if you don't own a copy of this year's model, you really owe it to yourself to get a copy. But from that day on, my ELP records and Chick Corea records were just Frisbees, and I bought every punk or new wave record I could get, and I dropped out of Berkeley within a few weeks. And I stuck around Boston for another few months, and I had the good fortune of working in Kenmore Square, which had this club called the Rat Scaler, but people called it the Rat. And it was Boston CBGB's. And the big breakout act of that scene was the Cars, but there was a really rich local scene, and band called DMZ, who later became the Liars, and the Real Kids, and the Atlantics, and La Peste. And there were these great groups visiting from New York, like the Dictators and the Cramps, and from San Francisco, the Nuns, who were fantastic. And at that same club, I saw Elvis Costello, I saw the Ramones, and the Dead Boys, and Mink DeVille, and Talking Heads, and like each one of them, it was like seeing the Beatles at the Cavern Club. It was just so exciting. And then Blondie came to town. And if you can see in the bottom right, it says, and David Johansen. And David Johansen was the lead singer in the New York Dolls, and this was his first solo tour. And also in his band was Sylvain, also from the New York Dolls. And they were fantastic. They were doing a lot of the new solo stuff of Johansen and some covers, but they also did a couple of Dolls songs like Personality Crisis and Looking for a Kiss. And I said, you know what, I think I need to find those two old Dolls albums, and they did not disappoint. And despite all the wrong notes and the occasional cacophony, I mean, those records are really as good as anything that you can find. And so I figured if Boston is this great, New York must be even better. So I moved back to New York that fall, and I kept seeing new bands when I could, and the story continues now. I'm actually going to read from the book, from the afterword. My deeper connection to Jerry Nolan began a few years later when I was 19. I was crazy about Jerry's sometime girlfriend, Leslie Vincent, who I met at a Devo show at New York's Bottom Line. I had a complete crush on her, and I'd find excuses to go places she might, or call her at home. And sometimes a grumbly guy would answer, curtly saying something like, she's at work now. And this turned out to be Jerry. When Leslie and I did speak, she told me about the best drummer in New York, who played on an album called L.A.M.F. And still it didn't quite connect with me. So when she suggested we go to CBGB one evening to see Jerry play with his band, the Rockettes, I gladly tagged along. And though I'd seen him on TV in '74 at one of the sold-out Sid Vicious shows in the fall of '78, and at an Idol show, this was a band he played in around that time, '78, '79, this would be the first time I'd watch him up close. Now, before the band came on, while we were standing in the audience, Jerry came over and spoke to Leslie. And though he was right next to me, Jerry and I did not speak. And in retrospect, he could probably tell I was a civilian. That was the phrase he would use for people who weren't musicians. With little money and none of the drugs he was looking for. But I could see that his hair and clothes were perfect. And his bleached blonde locks were coiffed into a post-punk pompadour that was so much hipper than my mess of a mop. He also wore a pink suit, a black shirt, and a white tie, which put my black jeans and thrown together togs to shame. And I quickly understood why any woman would want to be with him instead of me. And I never actually met Jerry until a spring afternoon in 1980 in the kitchen of Leslie's Mott Street apartment, which less than a year later would be mine. Jerry walked through the door, and what he was wearing did not register, as I was so consumed with finding the sweet spot between fawning and cool aloofness that all I could muster was the feeling of awkwardness. By now, I'd seen the Rockettes multiple times and immersed myself in both Dolls albums, the Heartbreakers' L.A.M.F., and the Idols' 45, and I was now going to meet the man himself. So Leslie introduced us, and we shook hands before she asked him how Rockettes' rehearsals were going. And he responded by saying he thought they were working on something the kids would really like. He was 33 at the time. He then looked down at his shoes forlornly and added, as if I would know. Before I knew it, he'd launched into an attack on her about how messy the apartment was, and then the two of them began to bicker, and sensing I was the third wheel on their bicycle, I beat a hasty retreat offering to bring them both some coffee from the neighborhood bodega. When I returned a short while later, he was gone. The very next day, I visited the Mott Street apartment again, only to find Jerry staring blankly at a television set. But what was odd was he wasn't staring at the screen. He was staring at the side of the set, motionless, as if he were frozen in some zombie-like state. Through facial gestures and hand signals, I asked Leslie why Jerry was acting so oddly, and all she could do was shrug her shoulders and offer a resigned, you know. Jerry left the Rockettes that August, and they went with an animated but less able drummer before I could even get a shot at the seat. I had work to do. The event that sealed the deal for me was when Club 57 on St. Mark's Place held an Elvis Presley lookalike contest as part of an irreverent celebration on the 3rd anniversary of Elvis's death. Our friend Felice had long, thick, dark hair, making her a perfect Priscilla, and all she needed was an Elvis, and I was drafted. And the ladies pomaded my hair, dressed me up in some of Rockette singer Dib Preston's gear and a pair of Jerry's shoes left behind after Leslie kicked him out for stealing her money. And they were like Beatle boots, but shorter, and they were terribly beat up and scuffed beyond the point where any reasonable person would even consider wearing them. Still, we shined them up, the girls squealing with delight as I crammed my feet into Jerry's tiny shoes. And we won the contest, with burlesque artist John Sex placing second, despite whipping out Little John. With the help of Felice and Leslie, I continued working hard on developing my own profile, which paid off when Jerry's replacement in the Rockettes didn't work out, and I received a call from their bass player. And 2 days later, after 2 rehearsals and inheriting 242 Mott Street, I was a Rockette, and through hard work and guile, tongue-tied Claudius was now assuming Caligula's throne. Traveling with the Rockettes, I heard the stories of Jerry's shenanigans, scams, hilarious and ridiculous raps, and prodigious drug intake. I was threatened in New Orleans because of a drug ripoff Jerry had pulled on a previous visit. I heard tales from girls he'd seduced and then abandoned. I also sensed the disappointment fans felt when they realized Jerry wouldn't be playing that night. And it was obvious Jerry had left a mark wherever he went. He was living a mythical, adventurous, and fabled existence, and just walking in his footsteps was an escapade. Outside of his solo single in '82, I saw neither hide nor hair of him throughout the '80s, but in July of 1991, out of nowhere, he appeared on the cover of the Village Voice with a 10-page feature on his life inside. It was a total shock. I mean, 25 years later, people still talk about that article, and it validated so much of what I thought was important: the Dolls, the Heartbreakers, punk rock, and Jerry's role in all of it. I read that article over and over. Years before, Leslie had shown me some of the photos in the article, and I'd also heard some of the stories. But what also struck me was that there was so much more that I knew that wasn't in the article. The stories of the Idols and the Rockettes, for instance. But it was great to see him get his due. Perhaps it was a sign of Providence that I should have acted upon, but the day before leaving New York to move to Seattle, I found myself in Union Square. And there on a crowded street, walking into a pharmacy was Jerry. And I thought about waiting outside for him and politely approaching him, and I've gone over this 100 times in my mind, and I'd say, "Excuse me, I doubt you remember me, but," and then I'd fill him in on the connections we shared and how I wanted to write a book and talk to him, and then we'd have coffee, and he'd start telling me story after story, and we'd bond, and the talks would turn into interviews, and we'd collaborate on his autobiography, and it would turn into a biopic on the scale of Amadeus, and a deep friendship, a new successful career would begin. But the reality was not so lofty. I decided to just leave him be and go on my way. After moving to Seattle, I was in a record shop called Bop Street in Ballard, one of Seattle's older neighborhoods. And the fellow that ran the place had been very friendly, lending me books from his private collection and rare bootlegs he had hidden. And we started talking, and I mentioned I used to play in the Rockettes and that Jerry Nolan of the New York Dolls had been their drummer. And one day I came in and he mentioned that he'd heard that Jerry had died. And I figured he meant Johnny Thunders, who had passed just a few months before. As this was, before the internet, and news just didn't move that fast. And plus, in 1992, no one seemed to care about those guys outside of New York. I mean, I just figured he'd mix the two of them up. Later, of course, it made sense, their deaths being so near to each other. They were too close for one to live much longer than the other. The drug use and a broken heart took their toll. I would like to move on now to talk about what Jerry called cutting a profile. rock and roll is littered with those who have used the medium to rechristen themselves. Johnny Allen Hendrix became Jimi Hendrix, and Robert Zimmerman became Bob Dylan, Jimmy Osterberg became Iggy Pop, and Richard Starkey became Ringo Starr, and Richard Meyer became Richard Hell, and David Jones became David Bowie, and Johnny Gonzalez became Johnny Thunders, and Little Gerard Stephen Nolan created an identity all his own to become Jerry Nolan. But it wasn't just the music, it was the surrounding aspects of the culture, and of particular interest to Jerry was clothing. And to Jerry, if you didn't look special, you were a civilian. And to him, that was anathema. And it was one of the things he loved about Johnny Thunders. Besides his instantly recognizable guitar sound, a combination of Chuck Berry, Keith Richards, Jeff Beck, Mick Ronson, and an alley cat who's touched the third rail of a subway, Johnny was a fashion icon in New York, even before the Dolls. His hair and his clothing stood out so much from the crowd. Jerry recognized him just from going to the Fillmore in the late 60s and other New York City hangouts. And fashion and clothing, it was one of the things they bonded on. They had a similar view of rock and roll. Simplicity, originality, and passion were at its core. And of course, they ended up addicted to the same drug as well. But the one thing they differed on was how you presented yourself on stage. Johnny was renowned for nodding out on stage, tripping over himself, saying boorish things, letting a hypodermic needle stick out of his hat. Richard Hell called him the Dean Martin of heroin. And just being out of control. And Jerry hated that. And Steve Dior from Jerry's group, The Idols, and the Sid Vicious Band, described it as being a rock and roll clown. Jerry hated that. He loved Johnny. Despite, he loved him like a father loves a son, despite Johnny abandoning him and betraying him over and over, he would always take him back. But his behavior on stage just disgusted him. And he'd tell people, Johnny's a sloppy junkie. It doesn't need to be like that. And Jerry just had way too much pride for that. And he would impart that to everyone he worked with. And I was lucky to interview people from Talking Heads and Sex Pistols and the Ramones, obviously before they died. They were in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but there were these other characters who just, I thought, added so much color to the story. And there was this guy, Paul Wassif, who was a guitarist, who actually has played a bit with like Eric Clapton and Steve Gadd, but he played with Jerry in this band, the London Cowboys, in the late 80s. And he loved not only playing with Jerry, but the total commitment Jerry had to what he thought a rock and roll show was supposed to be. And Jerry taught him the following. This is what he said. He said, you were supposed to look good. It wasn't an accident. When people pay to see you play, you put on a proper show. None of this falling over shit. You don't look like them. You look like you're supposed to be on the stage. He told me, that's your role. Your role is, quote, we are the fucking entertainers, unquote. And that's how passionate Jerry was about it. You don't look like those people in the street, period. According to Jerry's mother, the first job he ever had was as a teenager working for a valet in the hotel she worked in as a switchboard operator. And between the rock and rollers he watched, as well as the street gangs, he picked up a lot of things like an exaggerated pompadour. That's him in 1962. In junior high school in Lawton, Oklahoma, he was an Army brat. And all the other kids, all the other boys had crew cuts. And Jerry just that was Jerry. He dared to go out looking like that. He would wear jackets like you see him. He also played a little guitar. He just was committed to being what he called a rock and roller. He wore what he called continental suits. Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, or Dion and the Belmonts wore. He claimed that those same suits that they wore in Brooklyn in 1962 were what the Beatles wore in '64. He said the Beatles stole everything from Brooklyn. He just thought everything started in Brooklyn. That all fashion came out of Brooklyn. Forget about like the mods and Italian cuts and all that. He said it came out of Brooklyn. He spent a short while at New York's Fashion Institute, but it was much too regimented for him. He spent time going to a haircutting academy in Queens, but that was also too regimented. His mother, God bless her, I interviewed her when she was 92 and she passed away the year afterwards. She said, I bought him all these scissors from Germany. It was so expensive, and then he didn't want to listen to nobody. So that was the end of barbering. She said, barbering. What a great word, He'd cut band members' hair. He'd take them shopping for clothes. Another interesting character, I met Tom Backus, a guitarist that Jerry met in 1970. He told me this story after meeting Jerry for the first time, after Jerry answered a classified ad looking for a drummer. He said, I met him on 8th Street, And he was incredible looking because he had all these colors. And when I saw him, Jerry was like a god to me. He had the look, and he was everything that I aspired to be. He had the cockiness, and I was attracted to him because of his flair, not because of his drumming. So he and Tom started a band called Ocean, and there was another band called Ocean at the time who had a hit called Put Your Hand in the Hand of the Man, you know. And they were fine with that because people just confused him and they got better gigs and they picked up more girls. But Jerry was the driving force in their styling, and this is a very small chapter of the book. Jerry passed along his knowledge to the others on how to dress and carry yourself like a rock star. Said Tom, his term was profiling. There is nothing more important in the world than profiling. Rain, winter, cold spell, whatever, you have to always look your best. Wear your colors and the tight pants and the whole yards. He was like our mentor. So in pursuit of success, Jerry took command of the band's look and style, even taking members shopping. Said Tom, he pretty much bought my clothes because I didn't know anything about looking good for a rock star look. Jerry even went so far as to teach the band members how to walk properly. Like when they trained girls how to walk like models, he would show me how to do that strut, like a rooster strut, just showing off your rings. He just looked like he was in command of everything. Jerry would buy beat-up clothes at Salvation Armies and tear them apart and stitch them together to change the crease or the cut and change the buttons and the measure of the collar. In the late 60s, he designed a red velveteen suit, and it was so eye-catching, Jimi Hendrix himself called him over to his table at a club to check it out. And to Jerry, that was the highest compliment because he loved the Jimi Hendrix experience. He was really a 50s guy, 50s rock and roll, all the great 50s things, and even into the 60s, like pre-Beatles, rock and roll, R&B. But it wasn't really till Hendrix. He always said, the Beatles, I'd heard that stuff before. He just kind of dismissed the Beatles. I don't believe it, but that's what he would say. But Hendrix, that was it. And to him, you know, they combined an elite level of musicianship with equally impeccable and original styling. And he would take out this album and he would point to it for other band members. Says, you got to get it together like these guys. You know, they're not just a bunch of guys that play good. Look at them. Look at them. You need to get your shit together. But this is, you know, that's how dedicated he was and how particular he was. As I'd said, you know, for years before the Dolls, people would see him and wonder what group he played in. But the lessons of the Fashion Institute and the Haircutting Academy stayed with him. And of course, he chose pink drums. You know, this was a bold and defining statement. I mean, in 1973, for a man to wear pink anything, much less pink drums, in public, just took guts. But when he joined the Dolls, his look was a little too masculine for them, so Syl and Johnny took him shopping to femme him up a little bit. So in a few months, they got their record deal from Mercury, and he got 3 drum kits. 2 were Slingerlands, because Gene Krupa was a Slingerland drummer, a white one and a lime green one. But he also got an endorsement from Ludwig, and he chose pink oversized drums. One person told me he chose pink because it was Elvis Presley's colors. But it was also a way for Jerry to embrace the femininity the band had requested of him. It's like, you want me to embrace femininity? I'm going to take it 10 steps more than you ever thought. He selected these 2 giant floor toms and another nod to the past, what they called a canister-style drum throne, because it was the style the old drummers used. You could store gear in it, so the crew liked it, but it was something else that could be pink, whereas normal seat is just a skeletal frame. Another very colorful character, a New Jersey, New Yorker, Desmond Sullivan. I interviewed him. He was a member of their crew, and I asked him, I said, you want me to call you a roadie? He goes, it's like some Jackson Browne song, man. I don't know, you know. It's okay. So I asked him, you know, what was it like, you know, going out in the country with a pink kit? And this is what he said. And he would say, he knew I was recording the call, but he would say things, you write this down. I said, okay, I promise you I'm going to write it down. You write this one down. Okay, I'll write it down. This is what he said. He said, coast to coast, all over the world, people used to flip the fuck out. Nobody else had pink drums. Just taking those drums out and setting them up was like, holy fuck, the guy's got pink drums. Okay, I wrote that one down, you know. And that's what Jerry wanted. He wanted people to flip out, you know, and tracking those drums down. He got another 2 pink drum sets when he was in the Heartbreakers, and they're all, it's like finding Rosebud from Citizen Kane, you know. Where did they go? Who did he hock them to? Who did he sell it to? Nobody knows. But throughout his career, not only clothing, but he loved gangs. He consistently used gang, organized crime, or related street language, iconography, and imagery in all his band's work. The Dolls, they played these 20s-style gangsters for their Valentine's Day show in '74, which they dubbed the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. There was no hearts in Valentine's. The Heartbreakers called their one studio album L.A.M.F, which, close your ears, young people, stood for Like a Motherfucker, which was a gang tag. You would put that up in your territory to warn other gangs not to come into your territory because we're going to deal with you. If you went into another gang's territory, you would use D.T.K, meant Down to Kill. That's what they called their live album. And he read Iceberg Slim's books, who was a pimp, and decided to write books about the pimp life, both fiction and nonfiction. He's name-checked by Ice Cube and Ice-T as like the granddaddy of gangster rap. This is 15 years before that Jerry was reading those books. He read Gangs in New York 20 years before Martin Scorsese made a film out of it. He even had a small part in an independent film called What About Me as a gangster. It was just shortly before his death, and he brought his own clothing, he did his own makeup, he even wrote his own lines. The film's director, Rachel Amadeo, later said to me, he just really looked like a star. He looked like a gangster. He was fantastic. His lines were probably the most unforgettable in the film. Dee Dee Ramone's in the film, Richard Hell's in the film, Johnny Thunder's in the film. This is who you remember. And he is shot by another gangster. He asks for a cigarette, he coughs up blood, and in his last dying words says, "I have to smoke a lighter brand." As a society, despite reasonable fears about street gangs or mobsters, we love stories and the iconography they present. There are heroes, Robin Hood, who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor, and Pancho Villa, the Mexican bandit and revolutionary, and Pretty Boy Floyd, who Woody Guthrie sang about for charitable acts to the poor. There's Billy the Kid and Britain's Great Train Robber, and Bugsy Siegel and Joey Gallo. They're all celebrated because they, mostly just kept outwitting the authorities. Gangster rap, The Sopranos, the endless TV repeats of The Godfather, or Scarface, or Goodfellas. People love bad guys, and we love them in spite of their boorish and sometimes indefensible behavior, not only because they were really good at what they did, but because they were flamboyant, and they were loyal to a fault, and they lived by their own code, which is as American as apple pie. But like those mobsters who gained respect initially for their opposition to prohibition, thumbing their nose to all the town moralists, the priests, the teachers, the politicians, the parents, so too were rock and rollers, who fought these same authority figures for the right to dance, to listen to music from the other side of the tracks, to share friendship or love with those classified as others, drink, take drugs, oppose wars, or simply resist conforming to society's expectations. So Jerry's fascination with gangs goes back to before he was even 10 years old. And just to set up this little portion I want to read from the book, Jerry was the third child to Charlotte, and his mother Charlotte, and he had two older siblings, his oldest brother Billy Jr. and then his sister Rose, but his father William Sr. was not his biological father, his headstrong mother having found herself pregnant by another man, a man Jerry later described as a hustler. Jerry never knew his biological father, and the man married to his mother was an abusive drunk. Her husband was an alcoholic and prone to fits of abusive rage and violence, which led to the couple's divorcing by the time Jerry was 6. Charlotte wanted the children to stay with her. Her husband wanted the children too, but only his children. They went with him, except for Jerry, who moved with Charlotte back to Williamsburg, Brooklyn. In the years since Charlotte had left Williamsburg, it had changed mostly for the better. Depression-era public housing projects had replaced crumbling old buildings, providing a step up the economic ladder for immigrants, many exiting the crowded tenements of Manhattan's Lower East Side. With the Williamsburg Bridge allowing easy access to Manhattan, and local industries like the Domino's Sugar Factory and the Brooklyn Navy Yard and the Brooklyn Eastern District Terminal providing plentiful employment, Williamsburg in the early 1950s offered good middle-class opportunities. But the era also saw a challenge to that stability. Street gangs started popping up around Williamsburg and the surrounding areas. Different ethnic groups had their own gangs. The Puerto Ricans had the Mau Maus and the Hellburners. The Italians had the Sand Street Angels. The Jokers were both Irish and Polish. Blacks had the Bishops, the Robins, and the Fort Greene Chaplains. Each gang also had their own style of clothing. According to Paul Kendall in his book 50 Years of West Side Story, The Real Gangs in New York, quote, many had special sweaters which featured their gang's insignia, such as a crimson M.M. for the Mau Maus on the breast. The Beavers favored black felt hats, for example, while the Tiny Tims wore blue berets. Marlon Brando's iconic character in the 1953 film The Wild One made leather jackets and Levi's a more common choice for gang members. Kendall continues, hair was meticulously brushed into a pompadour, and the whole gang culture was influenced heavily by bebop and rock and roll. Fighting was known as bopping, and walking bop style meant to walk with a swagger, swinging your shoulders and hips. Gangs provided community and family for the young members. They were easily identifiable groups whose members looked out for one another, defending their territory and each other, to the death, looking cool all the while. Jerry, while too young to join a gang, took notice, picking up style tips and affectations that stayed with him throughout his life. So now we move on to L.A.M.F. It's the last section I'm going to read. It's also the 40th anniversary of this album, which, can reasonably be called a flawed masterpiece. So I did want to talk a little bit about L.A.M.F. and its lasting impact. Jerry never had any luck in a recording studio at the time that the Heartbreakers recorded L.A.M.F. In the spring of '77. He'd made a forgettable single with a band called The People in New York in the late 60s. And then about 1969, him and his childhood friend Buddy Bowser, and Buddy plays on both Dolls albums and toured with the Dolls, and he was friends with them till the day he died. They took their love of Hendrix, created an integrated power rock group called Maximilian. The producer and manager was a fellow named Teddy Van, who would later win a Grammy in 1991 for co-writing a song called Power of Love for Luther Vandross. And he was more experienced in girl groups and R&B, and he didn't really know how to record what was then heavy psychedelic rock. And the Dolls, 2 albums, the first produced by Todd Rundgren, who had produced hits and had many hits of his own, and the second by Shangri-La's producer Shadow Martin, they both had their sonic issues, particularly as far as the drums sounded. And this made those albums an even tougher sell. By the time the Heartbreakers got their record deal by going to Britain as part of the Anarchy Tour in December of '76, Jerry was in no mood to leave the sonic decisions to so-called professionals, and he wanted to take a lead role in the recording. So they started recording in the spring of '77, but when they were mixing it that summer, it sounded muddy and murky, and it just sounded wrong. The band came back to the States that August due to visa issues and played a set of shows at a New York club called the Village Gate, and all involved called this period the height of the Heartbreakers, as they'd had months of touring throughout the UK to tighten their set. And they were returning to New York as conquering heroes after leaving 9 months before, unable to get a record deal, mostly due to their reputations as unrepentant junkies. Before I get into talking about L.A.M.F., I wanted to say a little about Jerry's relationship with the Heartbreakers manager, Lee Childers. Now, Lee was a self-described Southern queen. He was a flamboyant gay man who was close friends with several of the drag queens of Andy Warhol's Factory, Wayne County, who's now Jane County, Candy Darling, Holly Woodlawn, sung about in Lou Reed songs. He stage managed many of the Warhol plays, featured Sam Shepard and Patti Smith. And when they went to England in '72 and he was the stage manager, David Bowie saw it and was just so taken, he hired the whole crew. He hired Lee, other people, Tony Zanetta, Cherry Vanilla, these great Warholian names, Cherry Vanilla, And through that, he toured with Bowie, traveled the world with Bowie. He was Iggy Pop's babysitter. He road managed Mott the Hoople. He was also a photographer, taking some of the first published photos of the original New York Dolls, as well as Debbie Harry and Blondie. This is more what Lee looked like when I interviewed him. He would like to be known this way. I love Lee. He has gone to his heavenly reward, but still, Lee was a doll. It was just a pleasure that any time you got to spend with Lee, he was hilarious and he didn't hold back. Lee had a great relationship with Johnny Thunders. He saw his job primarily that of keeping Johnny working and alive, because Johnny, like Jerry, was an unrepentant heroin addict. But he and Jerry were like oil and water. from day one. Jerry challenged Lee's authority. He demeaned Lee. He'd make fun of his clothing. He'd make fun of his friends, his sexuality. He lied to Lee. He tried to swindle money out of him. He just made his life difficult in every which way. And so while the band were not overly upset with the sound of the record, Jerry not only was appalled by it, but he still had enough sway over Johnny at the time to convince him that it had problems. So Lee now had to get the record remixed and convince the record company to do this. So I'm going to read a section of the book about L.A.M.F. The success of the Village Gate shows did not temper Jerry's displeasure with the album mixes. He returned to the UK before the rest of the band to attempt a remix of the record himself. He was tired of allowing so-called professionals who knew nothing about his music to make decisions about his records. He considered himself the real leader of the band, and he was going to get in there and get things right. He'd heard the 3 Sex Pistols singles, which sounded like an army bursting through your front door. The Damned's New Rose and the Clash's White Riot, as well as their albums, while somewhat shambolic, still were roaring flames of sound. Even the Ramones' 2 albums, though cheaply done, still sounded fresh and blistering in comparison. In Jerry's mind, only he could salvage the record. He told Lee, "I'll quit the band." So he was brought ahead secretly of the other band members. Upon reflection, Lee was still angry. They should have killed him, he said. In the end, he couldn't salvage the record. He just created another version of bad. Yes, the drums were loud, but it was a clattering and discomforting sound. Track Records insisted on using the mixes they'd chosen and planned to move forward with the Heartbreakers' L.A.M.F. on the scheduled October 3rd release date, so it would be on the shelves for the Christmas season. The band agreed to acquiesce to the label's wishes, all but Jerry, and true to his word, he quit. L.A.M.F. is reviewed glowingly in the major British trades of the day. The NME's Julie Burchill gave it a thumbs up, saying, "True romance rules here with rough brilliance." Sound's John Savage heaped on his own praise in his 4.5-star review. "This could be the party album of the next few months." Jerry received accolades from Savage, who commended his battering ram drumming on Baby Talk and Pirate Love, but even these beaming reviews noted the wanting sound, Burchill pointing out the ham-fisted Loch Ness dredging production of Speedy Keen and Daniel Secunda, who deserve at the very least to have their ears cut off. Savage noted what all involved in the process know only too well. They can't seem to get it quite right. But why did it sound so bad? Some blamed the mastering process, which is the last step in preparing a recording for transfer to vinyl. Walter, the other guitarist in the band, he blamed the band. He said, "We used to just play flat out loud." Lee thought it had something to do with the endless overdubs, which he felt had left the sound muddy and lifeless. Speedy Keen was blamed because he wasn't professionally trained as an engineer. His name was Speedy. I mean, come on, you could see what he was up to. Drugs were blamed, as everyone involved was on something or another throughout the process. Mike Thorne then was an EMI A&R man and a producer and engineer himself, like Tainted Love, Soft Cell, that's Mike Thorne. He just laid the blame on everyone. He said, "It's just incompetence all around, incompetence and indulgence." A large portion of the blame must be placed on the shoulders of Speedy and Danny. Neither of them had the track record or experience to produce and engineer a great record. Compared to Sex Pistols producer Chris Thomas, they paled in comparison. Chris produced without credit and played keyboards on several tracks of the Beatles' White Album. He mixed Pink Floyd's historic Dark Side of the Moon and produced 4 of the first 5 Roxy Music albums. Bill Price engineered the Pistols album and produced the first Clash album. He'd previously engineered and mixed Mott's 2 great post-Bowie records, Mott and The Hoople, and had worked with Beatle Paul McCartney. As amateurish as the Pistols and the Clash may have been as musicians, they were in experienced and professional hands while recording. The Heartbreakers were not. But few people blamed Jerry and his role in determining the sound of his drums. The one thing recordings of The People, Maximilian, The Dolls, and the Heartbreakers all had in common was Jerry. And his lack of success in getting his sound right in the studio hang over all of these recordings, and whatever fire Jerry could light under his bandmates, as well as the audience, was not enough to fully shine inside the cold walls of a recording studio. Danny Secunda, who had little to offer on the making of L.A.M.F., was, quote, pissed. That was what his email said to me. "I was pissed. that Jerry wanted a different drum sound after the drums had been recorded. As in his relationship with Teddy Van and Todd Rundgren and Shadow Morton, Jerry was unable to come to any sort of mutual understanding or healthy relationship with his producer, the authority figure in a recording studio. Peter Jordan, who was previously a New York Dolls roadie and also a very good bass player, he said Jerry wasn't articulate enough or together enough to actually assert himself in the studio to get what he wanted done. Whatever vision Jerry had in his mind of what drums were supposed to sound like, he could not get it across. As for Lee, his feeling was, quote, "It's the biggest, hugest fuck up in the history of rock and roll." L.A.M.F. would see a remix in 1984 and a reissue in 1994 when alternative mixes were released, and a 4-disc retrospective in 2012 when even more mixes were dredged up. And recently there's a new 40th anniversary edition. I don't know where the hell they're getting these mixes from. But such is the mythology of this record that it seems like trying just one more time and just a little bit harder will allow its greatness to finally shine through. While L.A.M.F. was universally panned for its muddy sound, there were more fans than just Savage and Burchell. As the years rolled on, young Henry Lawrence Garfield of Washington, D.C., and the slightly older Paul Harold Westerberg of Minneapolis would find some sort of personal validation in the record's combination of brute force, pop sass, and gritty urban authenticity. Garfield and Westerberg would form two of the pillars of 80s alt-rock, or indie rock as it was called then. Westerberg with the Replacements and Garfield working under the name of Henry Rollins in Black Flag. The Replacements would cover I Wanna Be Loved off L.A.M.F. in their lovable drunken style and write Johnny's Gonna Die about Mr. Thunder's seemingly inevitable pursuit. And as for Rollins, he would visit L.A.M.F. over and over years later on his Fanatic radio show. The Replacements captured the spirit of the Heartbreakers as well as anyone with their general who gives a shit attitude, standing in direct contrast to the seriousness of alt-rock bands like R.E.M., The Cure, or The Smiths, who were then the smart alternative to corporate rock. Additionally, Rollins' Black Flag may have been at the vanguard of the hardcore punk scene, but the sheer brutality of their musical attack and Rollins' unrelenting willfulness to go head-to-head with any lunkhead in the audience made them as much the spawn of the Heartbreakers as any band of their time. These were just two of the faithful who would sing the praises of L.A.M.F., but the number of fans who bought the record never grew beyond that of a cult, and sales never accumulated significantly. For his part, Jerry took no responsibility for any of the problems with the record. It was everybody else's fault, said Lee, always. After trying for a year and a half to keep Jerry in the drummer's chair, Lee was beside himself. He had put up with endless abuse from Jerry, sacrificed for him and the band by waiving his rightful 20% fee, and run all over town to get Jerry methadone. And now he was quitting. He saw satisfying Jerry as an impossible task. Quote, "He hated every gig I booked. He hated every sound man, every van driver. He hated track records. Turns out for no reason, it's like saying I hate retarded people. You don't hate them, you just don't sign contracts with them. He just hated anything that wasn't his idea and completely under his control." To Jerry, when no one stood by him to hold up release of L.A.M.F., it was an act of disloyalty and yet another abandonment, this time by his whole family. But the part he could not face was that he was as responsible for it as anyone. All right.